VR ownership for Steam users nearly doubled in 2018, at least according to a collection of the monthly Steam hardware and software reports released by Valve at the end of each month. Typically, those roundups offer curious size of Lancet month to math trends in us, VR, and PC component usage, but only data from the most recent month is publicly displayed. UploadVR, however, kept track of the monthly results for virtual reality headsets and crunched the numbers to find that, across all VR brands, the percent of Steam users that used a VR headset nearly doubled in 2018. According to that data, just over 5% of Steam users had a VR headset in January compared to 8 in December. On a per-headset basis, UploadVR's data shows an 85% rise in Oculus Rift users on Steam in 2018 alongside a 65% rise in HTC Vive ownership. Windows mixed reality headsets saw boost as well. At the beginning of the year, the platform did not have enough users to register on the monthly survey. At the close of 2018, 0.7% of Steam users had picked up a Windows mixed reality headset. However, it is worth noting that this data comes with a few caveats. The hardware survey, of course, only offers percentages, so it's difficult to put actual numbers to that growth. But for comparison's sake, Steam now has as many VR users as it does people running Linux as their operating system. Additionally, participation in the survey requires Steam users to opt in, meaning that the sample slice here does not include every single user on Steam. But even taken with a grain of salt, the collective maths of data offer an interesting look at how VR fared during last year. Like so much in game death, the decision to use procedural generation in your game is a double-edged sword. While it provides a theoretically unlimited amount of content, user profits of advantages of your game being bespoke and handcrafted. The goal, then, is to craft tools that can turn out procedural content in near infinite quantities and configurations while making that content feel as close to homemade as possible. To explore some different approaches to that problem, Gamasutra reached out to a number of devs with experience working with procedural tools and asked about how they felt about different methods of content generation, and how they avoid making procedural content that feels banal and recycled. First and most obvious is the question of why choose procedural content in the first place. For Kitfox Games, Tanya X, co-editor of the book Procedural Generation in Video Games, the answer is simple: it's just more interesting. It's a way to build something that even its creator does not fully recognize. Procedural content and handmade content each have their own strengths and weaknesses. To me, the main difference is that I enjoy creating procedural content far more as a designer, because my creation has more opportunities to surprise me. For just among of subset games who utilizes procedural content, both in their breakout hit flaws, well as their new title Into the Breach, it's not necessary to exclusively choose one or another, either procedural or handmade. Both approaches to content creation have a place in the game's world, and both can lead to great results if executed well. Moses, speaking as a player of games, I am generally less interested in completely linear games that test if you can achieve the goals laid forth by a designer exactly how they intended you to play. I am much more interested in exploring dynamic systems that give the player a lot of leeway to express themselves. However, the most compelling games to me often use both procedural and handmade content. The key focus is always to ensure that at the end you have a product that's engaging and fun. Above all other considerations, procedural content, properly deployed, can help with that. You could simulate complex procedural systems that are amazing from a technical perspective. But if they are not aiding in making the game enjoyable, it's kind of a waste. For example, we found that heavily restricting the procedural generated elements was necessary to make into the bridge battles less frustrating. Instead, we relied on creating simple mechanics that can interact with each other in a variety of interesting and dynamic ways. That solution is a perfect illustration of how bespoke and randomly generated content are not necessarily oppositional, and can actually be used to amplify each other's strengths. Within To the Bridge, we found that the amount of fun you do have with the game was highly dependent on where enemies stood in relation to their environment. If an enemy is in a corner, attacking a building, it's much more likely that you will be unable to neutralize the threat without causing collateral damage to the buildings. Continues Mode. This feeling of having no potential solution was unacceptable to us, so it became clear that we would need to create environments that would minimize the chances of this happening. The types of problematic terrain configurations was quite varied, so we eventually decided that we could not rely on procedural generation of maps. Instead, we opted to manually design the basic layout of each map and use procedural generation for less important aspects of maps, such as forests and sand locations, as well as elements that were unique to specific missions, such as where key structures were spawned. The result was a lot of variety of maps, while avoiding problematic layouts as much as possible. However, if you play enough, you will likely start recognizing key features. Zabir Hoque, an engineer at Systematic Softworks, whose 2016 release Astroneer leans heavily on procedurally generated elements, agrees that the best results are often produced when procedural and bespoke content is married together. Generally, handmade content allows for a level of polish that is very hard to replicate with an entirely procedural system. Hoque says, the goal with procedural content is to provide novelty, but we want some level of familiarity, so the player is not just experiencing chaos. Artists and designers can be extremely convincing, and building procedural systems that can match that level of care and quality can be quite hard. That being said, having procedural systems enables scenarios that would otherwise be impossible. For instance, in the case of Astroneer, creating varying game planets that provide alternate experiences each playthrough. In generating the landscapes of Astroneer, Hoque and his team use handmade assets as landmarks to break up procedural content and make the whole seem less random and unfamiliar. They treat these handmade pieces as having an area of influence that extends around them into the procedural content and influences it in terms of player experience. For Hoque, building procedural tools is not just a way to save labor or reduce the amount of artistic content required to build a game. Quite the contrary, it's a way to empower artists. From a technical side, I think the most important thing to consider when building procedural systems is how to allow for artistic control at various authoring levels. Hoque explains, you want to allow for authoring a rule set for general use cases, and then provide enough vectors of configuration so users can exercise artistic control when needed. And Hoque echoes Mo's sentiments about ensuring that the final product is entertaining and enjoyable. About serving the player first. With our terrain system, we could just use Perlin noise everywhere in the terrain with random values and say, look, it's different every time. But this is what leads to the feeling of bland repetition. Instead, we try to think of how the player will play the game, and when they will seek out novelty. And that is where we try to introduce variation. Once you have landed on procedural generation, the challenge becomes masking its randomly crafted nature, as much as possible, or unifying it with handmade assets. Honestly, there are so many considerations it's hard to sum up. Short says, basically, most newbies in procedural generation are afraid of chaos and random nonsense, when what they should be worried about is generating too much semi-boring blandness. Short plans to address this very issue in her TED Talk on March 22nd, where she will refer to the work of designers like Drive, Emily Short, who develops middleware artificial intelligence and security solutions at Spirify, and Jason Grinblat, of Caves of Cat fame. It's a scary, giant topic that I do not think anyone has solved. So I hope nobody in the audience brings tomatoes.